Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consol, your host. Before we begin this episode, I want to alert you that my latest book is now available in both print and ebook formats. The title is Love American Style, and it is a collection of short stories about men, women, their passions, and their dysfunctions. There's a short link in the episode notes that will take you to my Amazon profile page, where all 4 of my books are listed, 3 novels in this new short story collection. Again, the title of the new one is Love American Style, named after the TV series that ran from 1969 until 1974. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is John Darnton, novelist and author of a new book, a new novel, Burning Sky, as well as being a New York Times alumni, a newspaper at which he won a Pulitzer Prize and 2 George Polk Awards for his reporting. I mean, he was a City Hall reporter. If we go back early on, City Hall reporter covering the John Lindsay and Abe Beame administrations. Having grown up in upstate New York, those names are so familiar to me. I probably have read and heard of from some of John's writing without even knowing of it at the time. In 1976, he went abroad, became a foreign correspondent for the newspaper. He was in places like Africa. Some of the African nations were Lagos in Nigeria, Nairobi in Kenya, South Africa, Rhodesia, Ethiopia. The list goes on. He also was based in Warsaw, the home of the Warsaw Pact, for those of you who remember the Cold War as vividly as I do. And also home, of course, of the Solidarity movement with Lech Walesa. And we'll find out whether John had any time with Lech back in the day, and whether he has any things to tell us about Eastern Europe, the old Soviet bloc, and so on. It was 1982. He won a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. And that was for his coverage of Poland under martial law. And that was as a result of the rise of Solidarity, which I had just mentioned, Lech Walesa being the leader of that movement. He also spent time, probably as a reward for all that tough duty and less luxurious places. He was bureau chief in Madrid and London. And he retired from the New York Times in 2005. Now, he would moonlight as a reporter. He was paid to be a reporter. He would moonlight as a fiction writer, ultimately publishing 5 novels. And they're said to be notable for their sinister themes and exotic settings, for overcooked plots that seem custom made for Hollywood. Now, his latest, again, is Burning Sky, in which he brings to life a nightmare scenario in the not too distant future. Science comes into play with John Darnton novels. He's got an interest in it. I'm not sure how deep it is or what his favorite line of science is, but he's here to answer all things John Darnton. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike. Good to be here. And man, what an introduction. You somehow made me sound impressive.
Well, you are impressive. I mean, people dream of being foreign correspondents and living in exotic and even dangerous places and beautiful places. And boy, you covered some continents there. And did you, when you were in Warsaw, in Poland, was Lech Walesa one of the people you spent time interviewing?
Oh yeah, a lot of time. I got there in 1979, which was before the Solidarity movement broke out, and it was a kind of what they called a normal communism. But it was like looking at a building that seemed kind of solid, but the foundation was rotting, and there were signs of unrest here and there. But no one, not any diplomat I ever talked to, expected it to really kind of blossom into this first movement attacking communism directly by coming up with an alternate trade union, a non-communist union. Wałęsa was amazing. I met him just when the strike broke out in the shipyards in Gdansk. And, he had been an electrician there. He climbed over the wall when the workers went on strike. They went on strike because of a a wonderful 80-year-old grandmother who worked as a crane operator, and she was a political activist. And they tried to fire her, and she refused, and she kind of sat in on her crane, and it grew from there into a strike that caught on with other industries and paralyzed the whole country. But Walesa was a natural street leader. You know, he was somebody who was plucked from obscurity, and within 2 weeks, say, or three, he became a worldwide figure on the cover of news magazines and everything. He was not widely educated. He once told me he never read a complete book. He said he got tired around page 24. Um, but he had this ability to speak to a crowd and sense what their direction and mood was, and articulate it and lead it. So every night he would come from the strike hall, this big old workers kind of a building, to the front gate of the shipyards. And there would be TV cameras and huge crowds and flowers and a picture of the Pope. And he would kind of convey, the mood of the strikers on that day. And it was amazing to see. So he also had a slightly, darker side. I think it's probably true that he really got well-headed as things went on, and as he became voted president of the country after after 89, when all the communist wall crumbled, and he became convinced he was right in everything, and alienated some people who had been close to him. But when I think back on it, he was just a remarkable person.
Yeah.
Kind of,
I had heard what you said, that he was not terribly well educated. He misused the
no,
language a lot, but he was
yeah,
brave and he was committed.
yeah,
He really put himself on the line, and I like the way you put that. That he had, what did you say? Street leadership was the phrase you used.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you see these people who come into who rise in around the world occasionally. They're rare. They're rare, particularly in countries where there's an iron fist over the
Yeah,
people. But
yeah,
he went for it, and in the end, I remember at one point they had cracked down. Check me on this, John, but I believe they cracked down, declared martial law. He ended up actually, uh, head down on a desk in tears, just thinking it was all over. But in the end,
yeah, yeah.
he and the movement persevered, and they won the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Martial law, which happened on December 13th, 1982, brought an end to the whole thing. The whole country came, it was a snowy night, uh, freezing, and Jaruzelski, the general who had taken over the leadership of the country, moved very stealthily, and tanks took over the streets, and
Yes.
telephones everywhere were knocked out of commission, and the country lost contact with the outside world. There were no satellites back then to transmit.
Right,
I think.
right. Yeah,
Uh,
Jaruzelski, is that was the
yeah,
president's name at the time?
that's right.
And
Yeah,
didn't they hold?
Jaruzelski.
I hope I'm not confusing him with the head, the president of East Germany, but I remember that they
Ulbricht.
actually finally did hold an election, and I remember his photograph in the newspaper, meaning Jaruzelski, and the quote, "Our defeat is total." They got wiped out. I don't know. I don't know if you remember that. I have a good long-term memory, John, but I may have them mixed up. But I
Yeah,
remember that phrase,
yeah,
"Our defeat is total." Just the
yeah,
fact that they got wiped out, and he was willing to say, "We have been defeated," and it's been a
yeah.
total
And
defeat,
I
which
interviewed him
you don't
once
even
in New
see that in the
York.
United States some of the time now.
Yeah, I interviewed him in New York once, some years after, and he got nostalgic mood. And I asked him, "Well, if you had to do it all over again, meaning declare martial law, would you?" And he said, "Well, if I had to do it all over again, I'd put a bullet through my brain."
Wow.
Amazing. Because he was, he was reviled at the time by a lot of Poles because he repressed the country. And he basically, the idea was he would allow communism to persist, even though it had been rejected by so many people, who were voting with their feet. I mean, they were all going out on strike all the time. Um, and it was like, what an amazing thing. I arrived there, as I said, in 79, and the country was kind of slightly, it was repressed. There was secret police everywhere. Our house was bugged. You had to be careful of who you hung out with. We didn't so much, but Poles did. Then came 16 months of absolute freedom under solidarity and moving to the West and long night discussions and saying things that had never been said about Russians, calling them occupiers and everything. And then bang, down came martial law and repression returned, only doubled down. So it was like turning a complete circle, 360 degrees from repression to freedom to total suppression without moving, all in the same country. And I could see friends acting differently in each of these three periods. And in the last period, some people said, I can't see you anymore. We can't be friends. It's too dangerous. It really gave me this kind of gut feeling for what a totalitarian society can be like. It's fearful,
Yes, yeah, and people, your own family members might tattle on you, and now there's the knock on the door, the bang on the door,
Yeah.
very frightening stuff, and you were party to it, a witness to it, and reported it to the world. Great stuff, John, and here's all
Oh,
the. I
thank
mean, Lech Walesa was. I mean, he's like a character from a novel, almost hard to believe what he did accomplish, but he did it, and others around the world have done that. Yeah, along
Mhm.
the way, all this exciting stuff you were doing, John, you started thinking in terms of fiction, and moonlighting as a fiction writer.
Yeah,
Talk
yeah.
about, did you always know you wanted to write fiction, but you were
Well,
too busy making a living before you had a chance
yeah,
to start carving out evening hours?
it's funny what a good question, because when I was younger, that is, in college days, I used to have fantasies of, wouldn't it be great to be a writer? Wouldn't that be wonderful? But I never really kind of did much about it. It was more of just a dream, you
Now,
know.
these were your college days at University of Wisconsin-Madison?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And Melville once said, be true to the dreams of your youth. I wasn't.
Yes.
I went into journalism without preparation. I never took a course in journalism. I never wrote for a school newspaper, but I became very enamored in my last year at Wisconsin when I went to visit my older brother, Bob Darnton, who was then working for the Times for 1 year. And he was covering what was called the Police Shack in New York, right across from the police station on Center Street. And that was a place where, every newspaper then was represented, and they basically held the pulse, of the most toxic part of the city. Every murder, every suicide, every crime, every fire, anything bad that happened would be piped into this one room. And I thought it was terrific.
Let me
Um,
back you up a minute. What was
yeah,
the Melville quote again about following the
I
dreams
think
of your
it's
youth?
like, be true to the dreams of your youth.
Okay, now did you do what was the dream of your youth? Was it
So
to
here, fantasies about being a writer, right? But then I went into journalism and I did it for 40 years.
well, that is writing.
Well, I made a
You're thinking fiction,
decision.
right? Your real dream was fiction writing.
Yeah, but
Okay.
I let it go for all those years, and I loved the life of a journalist, especially a foreign correspondent. I once was invited to a writer's kind of workshop in Bennington, as a foreign correspondent.
Mm-hmm.
And I confessed when I was there to this small gathering, well, I'm an imposter. I'm not a writer, I'm a reporter. And okay, I write things that are technically called stories, but they're based on fact as much as possible. I wouldn't dream of interjecting a note of fiction, even if it would make it somehow more perfect. More perfect is grammatically incorrect.
Mm.
Perfect. Um, but I really felt there was a difference between the two. And then one time I got a job at the Times as what's called a weekend editor, putting out the Sunday and Monday newspapers, which meant I had off Monday itself and Tuesday and Wednesday. By Thursday, things began to get very busy, but I had all this free time on my hands. And I happened to see a story actually in the Washington Post that said that the Neanderthal, remember the Neanderthals? Um,
Yes.
I always thought they were just this kind of uh, a branch that went nowhere on the family tree. But this story said that French paleontologists had discovered that they really lived the same time that we did, or our ancestors, Homo sapiens, Cro-Magnon. And suddenly I started thinking, well, what happened? Why did we win out in the great lottery of life? And why did they pass away? And so I decided, wouldn't it be fun to just imagine a remnant band of them live on somewhere way up in the mountains of, say, Kazakhstan, where no one goes,
Mm-hmm.
and they're discovered by modern day humans, by some anthropologists, and they recreate what might have happened way back in the Pleistocene, why we won out, what we had that they didn't have, or
I
what
just recently learned about that the Neanderthals just, yeah, but they were kind of coterminous to our ancestors and went extinct, and we
they.
weren't sure why. Now, your first novel was called what? The
So that was
Neanderthals?
it. Yeah.
Yep.
And it worked. It was fun to do. And I decided, hey, this fiction is kind of interesting. You can make up the quotes, You don't have to go through your notebook and do every word precisely. And
And at the same time, you probably did a lot of research.
yo, a lot. Yeah. I was in London then, and the Natural History Museum there, in particular, anthropologist or paleontologist called Chris Stringer was very helpful. And so I tried to use science, um, not science fiction, even though the story itself is totally made up, and some parts of it, couldn't happen, but it's basically real science as much as possible, with one or two kind of very obvious, detours into the realm of the imagination. So it's not science fiction per se. It's science that's actual, that could actually happen.
Do we know why they went extinct, or is that still
No,
We
no.
don't. Okay.
But we now know a lot more about them than was known at the time I was writing, and including the fact that many people of European descent and elsewhere even, have Neanderthal DNA. We all have some in us. So that kind of suggests we may have just swamped them genetically, and
So,
that we just kind of the Cro-Magnon came on through Africa into their realm, and who knows, we had something, hunting techniques, um,
or some gene
maybe,
resistance, maybe. I mean, something
yeah,
comes along and
yes,
wipes
yeah,
out one particular
yeah,
species or strain,
yeah.
and
Probably
while
not,
others are resistant.
probably not intelligence, because their brains were pretty big.
Yeah,
Um, the and body mass and all that, and they were very strong.
they sure
Uh,
looked it. They had the big
but
head, the big cranium, so you figure there's a
yeah,
large brain in
yeah,
there. and they
Yeah.
looked strong. I mean, it was not an easy life at the time.
But some people think we had, that we had art, and they did not. The caves of
Mm.
Altamira in northern Spain showed me the power of prehistoric art. I mean, it's just amazing. The bison that are created there that are so much better than anything I could draw, And
Mm.
you think, how could someone, all those years, 30,000 years ago, have
I've had
created
that skill.
something so beautiful?
Yeah.
Um, so
Don't you
art,
think that's one of the mistakes we make? We tend to think we're very sophisticated today, and
oh
people
yeah,
from hundreds or thousands of years ago were completely unsophisticated, completely naive. But the fact is that the way we live today, we are so cordoned off from the things that were probably high intelligences and connection with
yeah,
nature, maybe
yeah,
connection to a higher power of some kind of spiritual dimension.
yeah, yeah. And I hate to become too serious, but look what we're doing to the planet for all
Mm,
our intelligence. We're
hmm.
making, we're rendering it unlivable, basically,
Yeah.
ultimately. So I'm not sure how smart we really are.
Yeah.
And
Definitely the jury's still out on that.
yeah.
Let me ask you this. To what extent do you, as a fiction writer, do you think that you are a reporter who does fiction writing versus, because here you did a lot of research on this. You introduced science into your books. That requires research. But
Oh yeah. Yeah.
that's very different than the person who writes maybe well, certainly somebody who just writes a fantasy novel, whereas this is completely made up, or the Terry Pratchett doing Discworld, creating a completely different world with all its own rules. Then it's
Yeah.
all just, hey, a lot of fun, but not repertorial. It sounds like your fiction writing is almost a fusion between the repertorial and the literary.
Oh yeah, no, I like to think of it that way. Reporting was certainly essential to all of my books. I wrote one on Darwin that just began when I made a visit to his house, called Down House, and the curator there, they wanted me to write a story for the New York Times about it because they needed money, and there were leaks in the roof and everything. It was kind of dismal. But the curator gave me a real wonderful tour and let me, she removed the velvet rope so I could sit in the chair that he wrote in, a chair that had
Mm.
little, a horsehair chair with that had rollers on the bottom so he could scoot around, and go to microscopes or whatever. And as I was seated there, she put up a kind of a wooden thing across the arms, like a board that had blotting paper in the center. And she said, "This is where he wrote Origin of the Species." And I saw the
Amazing.
little ink marks on the side and everything. And I just had this flash of, my God, I'm sitting, in the cradle of one of the greatest advances of all time. And then the curator took this board off and said, "Now come with me," and took me to a corner and moved aside a curtain and said, and I looked down, and there was a bowl on a kind of a little rise. And she said, "This is his private vomitorium." His stomach would seize up in the middle of writing. He would put that board aside, rush over here, and lose his breakfast or lunch.
Wow.
And that knowledge, that experience made me, I became fascinated with him, read everything about him.
What was that all about? Was that
Well,
just he had
you know,
gastrointestinal problems?
no, nobody knows to this day. And for 18 years after he had came up with the basics of the theory of evolution, he didn't write about it. So my theory is, he was at one time religious. His wife, Emma, was very religious and would write him letters. Imagine writing a letter to someone in your house saying she felt so sad that she would spend eternity up there in heaven. And if he kept up with all this nonsense about human evolution, it wasn't called that then by her, he wouldn't be able to accompany her in paradise. So, he was conflicted, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
deep conflict, because he was so bright, he knew where his theories would lead. But back to the origin of the question, it was research from then on every part of his life, and especially the 5 years he spent on the Beagle. And that's what makes it fun to do. And then I inject fiction into it, and a competitor on the Beagle, and how he actually came up with the theory. And that part's untrue, but it was fun to write.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
and so it's taking actual science and then giving it a twist to illustrate some point. And the point in this, I mean, I doubt people are going to go back and read it, is that he gets the theory from what he calls a savage in Tierra del Fuego, a shaman that he meets one night. And they exchange it, and the shaman says, well, what do you think about, the origin of life, kind of, and Darwin goes into the whole Christian explanations with all of its strange things, virgin births and everything else. And he says to the shaman, well, what do you think? And shaman says, well, see that tree over there with branches? We think life probably began very simply, and then grew larger and more complex, and creatures began. And suddenly the whole idea pops into his mind, and he steals it, and he and his competitor race back. Whoever gets to London with this idea will become world famous. So that's the twist, to
See,
give it,
that was
to make it fictional.
the origin of species right there. I mean, that's what got him going, huh?
Of course, it's all untrue. I mean, you just don't take it that part seriously,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's fun.
But I like, yes, yes, I love that the having a shaman in there. Let me ask you, when you made the an assiduous effort to become a fiction writer, and you're moving from nonfiction to fiction, how different and difficult was that? And I asked this question because the great Tom Wolfe, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, The Right Stuff, decided I'm going to be a fiction writer now. And I remember he said that he ran into a wall. He was crestfallen by the whole experience because he felt
Yeah.
like he couldn't get anything done, even though like you, his fiction books were very thoroughly researched, and then he'd go to write it as fiction, and it took months, maybe longer than that, for him to finally get traction and realize,
Yeah.
okay, I can do this. But at first, he thought, I can't do this. I can't be a fiction writer. It's too difficult. What was your experience like? Was it
Yeah.
natural to you or not?
Uh, what happened to me was, I wrote just a kind of a brief synopsis of this first book, Neanderthal, and Random House bought it for a song. I mean, the advance they paid was barely enough, I don't know, to make
Get
it.
you a cup of coffee.
Yeah. Uh, and so I wrote one chapter, and then I won what I always wanted, which was a foreign assignment. So I put it on a shelf, forgot about it, and there I am abroad. And I suddenly got a call from a friend of mine who's in LA, who said, you won't believe it. There's another book that's just been auctioned that has your same plot about primitives who are discovered, and they have, that whole question of what do we have that they don't have, and it's called Almost Adam, and it's been bought for a movie at over $1 million. And I was crestfallen. I
Wow.
thought, oh, there
Yes.
goes my idea. I called my agent and she said, all right, don't move. And she auctioned my little, offering, and Spielberg bought it and paid more than they did for Almost Adam. So suddenly I was locked into, I had to write the book. And I thought, can I write this book? I called up the executive editor at the Times and said, look, this is my chance to kind of really write something. Um, I need some time off. And he said, all right, you can take time off. But if anything happens, I was in London then, anything happens, you got to jump back in and forget your book. So I went down, began writing. And then John Major, who was then the prime minister, called an election, and I had to stop and cover the election. And then I went back to it. And I was talking to a friend from a guy named David Lamb from the Los Angeles Times. The foreign correspondents all hang out together. And I said, I don't know what to do. I only write, 1,000 words a day, and I can't do more. And he said, John, that's all you need. Think about it. Most of the newspaper
Yeah.
articles in those days were 800 words. So I was used to that. And he said, if you do that every day, at the end of 3, 4 months, you'll have enough for a book. And I suddenly thought, this isn't a mountain I have to climb, looking down from the bottom all the way up to the summit. How am I ever going to get up there? It's a series of hills. And if I just climb one hill every day, that'll work. So I set an arbitrary limit. I have to write 900 words every day, no matter how long it takes me. And I will stop as soon as I hit 900, even if I'm in the middle of a paragraph.
Interesting. Interesting.
And
So
it
some
turns
people,
out,
oh, so you would stop at 900 even
yeah,
if you were in the middle of a paragraph. Okay.
uh, and it worked, because it's not then you sit down, you think, oh, I only have to write 900 words. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you read what you wrote the last paragraph the day before, and it gives you a kind of springboard, and you write another 900. It may take 3 hours, but then you knock off, you have lunch and the rest of the day to kind of think about it. Or it may even take an hour if somehow you're inspired. So
But
doing
Tuesday,
bit by
900 words on Tuesday could be a really different quality of 900 words than Thursday's 900. What about that? How many words did you throw out when you would come back and say, when it became editing time, when it became
yeah.
putting it all together?
Well, I mean, I always read the previous days, right? So that tried to give me a uniformity of, say, tone or mood, and it reminded me where I was and where I wanted to go. But then at the end, then you revise the whole thing and you drop a character or something that doesn't work, or you add something. So revision is very important. Um, but
So as you say,
it was.
900 words a day times 6 or 7 days a week times
Yeah.
and I'm going to, my book will probably be say 350 to 400 pages. You could dope it out to where you're saying, okay, it's going to take me 3.5 months, but it would actually take longer than that, correct? Because yeah, not that you're not being very
Sure.
productive, only that the rewriting, the jettisoning of certain copy just because it's like this really isn't working, and now I'm going to do a rewrite on that part. So your typical novel, John Darnton novel, if you were to average it out, how long did it take you to produce them?
Well, see, then I never just was able to write for a long time, full time, because I always had to squeeze it in around my journalistic
Mhm.
assignments. So I'd work on holidays, work sometimes in the evenings or mornings, and knock off, and then do my real, what I called my real job. Um, so it's very hard to say how long they took if I were to string it all together.
I
But
see.
once you do a certain amount every day, and you end up with a completed book, even though it needs a lot of work, as you point out, more to be done on it, you've got the substance, you've got the main body of it,
Yeah. Well,
and
the
the rest.
key is actually
Yeah,
getting to sit down and be
yeah,
productive and
yeah,
get it out there, because that's, I mean, if you don't get that part done, nothing else follows.
yeah, exactly.
So
And since
now is it,
then,
oh, go ahead, finish that thought.
no, I was just going to say, since then, I've been reading about writers, and many of them adopted this idea of a daily word quota. Graham Greene had 660 words he had to write every day for some
Yeah.
reason. I don't know why. And Hemingway did the same, it turned out. Um, so
Different word count, but
yeah, his was higher, I think. Uh, and it's a technique that works.
yeah,
Uh,
because it
yeah,
really forces you to set aside your well, this in inner censor who wants to tell you, hey, this is lousy, it's not working. Why don't you go call a friend instead? I mean, you have to get past the procrastination. You have to get past that
yeah,
internal censor
and
that's judging every sentence that you're laying out there. How effective
yeah,
were
it's a
you at that,
short view.
John?
Exactly. It's like taking a short view. All I
Yeah.
have to do is work today to do this today, certain amount, and I'm not even going to worry about, how, pouring my guts out onto an empty page, for hour after hour and having a glass of absinthe and then going back. Yeah, yeah, you
The
just
magic formula.
do it
Yeah.
as a task.
Yeah, if you look at it as, okay, this is a 500-page novel, it's such a monumental
Oh,
project. But yeah, when you
God.
get it down to bite-sized pieces,
Yeah,
and if you're
that's the secret.
consistent, you end up realizing, wow, I'm making a lot of progress
Yeah,
here.
yeah. And
And you can
sometimes
even time it out. I mean, when you're able to write full time, which you are able to do now because you're retired.
yeah, yeah. And
So
that
what's
makes,
your regimen like then? Are you a morning
well,
writer? You get up in the morning, or are you an evening writer? How does it work for you? Because you used to write evenings, right? So did you
yeah,
make the switch to mornings, or did you
yes,
develop such a,
yes.
you did. Okay, tell us about
Absolutely. Mornings are much better. A lot of coffee and I'm
it.
reminded of
Absinthe.
a British novelist I met once. I said, what's your best time for writing? He said 7 o'clock in the morning. I said, that's wonderful. I said, no, no, I get up at 9.
So-
But it does help to have a kind of a routine. Like if you can start every morning and I don't know, after breakfast or something, I think
you have a
that
routine?
it's become kind of ragged these days. You know, my
Does that
my
inhibit you at
this
all, or do you kind of allow there to be kind of do
now
you
I'll
extemporize
skip
a little
days
bit?
now. I'll skip days. I'll take it a little more easy because I'm not worried about having another job. And this is my seventh book and the sixth novel, but my last book was a memoir. And I found that very different because suddenly I was back to reporting again and with no element of fiction if I could avoid it.
So you
Uh,
did your Russell Baker memoir then.
yes, yes.
Yeah, Russell Baker, the great, if anybody doesn't know Russell Baker, great New York
Yeah,
Times columnist, well, reporter, then columnist, and he won a Pulitzer for his first memoir, one of two memoirs. Was that
yeah,
one called The Good Times, or do I have them backwards?
I think backwards. What was that called? The first, both wonderful books. I mean, he
Yeah,
was
I read both of them. I thought they were
such a
both
good writer.
wonderful.
Did you interview him?
No, I wasn't doing this at the time, so
Yeah,
no, I never did, and he's moved on since then to be with the great shaman in the sky.
yeah.
Um, I'm just looking him up right now, though. I want to get this right. Both of them are, like you said, wonderful memoirs, and they really do. Growing up,
Uh-huh.
growing up is
Yeah,
one, and then
yeah,
there's the good times. but
Yeah.
which one is which? I don't even know.
I
Anyway,
think
they're both wonderful. Go ahead. Which one do you think
I
it is?
think Growing Up must be the first one. Uh,
Yeah, I think you're right. And then I think it's Good Times or The Good Times.
mhm.
Um, yeah, and in fact, I'm looking at the cover. It's him as a little boy on the cover. So that is it. And I remember the second one starts up with he's visiting his mother who's into dementia by that point. It's a sad beginning to the book, and he may have even come full circle to the
Yeah, yeah,
to her
yeah,
at the end again.
yeah.
So, your memoir, talk about your memoir. We'll
Oh,
talk about your new
sure.
novel in a minute,
I'd
but
love
your
to.
memoir, what did you seek to cover during your memoir?
Well, basically, um, my father was a war correspondent for the New York Times, and he was killed in the Pacific in World War II. And I was 11 months old at the time, so I have no memory of him at all. My older brother, Robert, I mentioned before, was 2.5, and he has no memory either. But our father assumed this gigantic role in both our lives because our mother never remarried. She said she had had her allotment of love, built this portrait of him as a spectacular, smart, gregarious, um, gallant, wise, loving, understanding, profound newspaper man. And my brother thought, well, he'll be a newspaper man. I mentioned his time at the Times. He tried it and did not like it at all. And he went back to his natural first love, which was history, and became a very well-known historian in European history, especially France. And suddenly I decided, well, I'll become a reporter. And I started as a copy boy at the Times, knowing almost nothing about it and just kind of taking 2 years to assimilate what it's like and everything. And then I heard you mention I covered City Hall. That's true. And
Hmm.
while there, the fiscal crisis broke out. This is when New York went broke in the mid 70s,
Hmm.
and nobody knew what was going to happen. And so it became a page one story day after day. And on the strength of that, I was finally offered what I wanted, this foreign assignment and a chance to go to Africa, which I leapt at. But the week before I was to leave, something really strange happened. In my mailbox in the New York Times on West 43rd Street, they had these pigeonhole boxes. I saw a package and I went, took it to my desk and opened it. It had come from the Chicago Tribune from an archivist there, and it was the last notebook my father wrote in up until the exact moment of his death. And he described being on a boat with American troops and a plane flying overhead and circling and leaving and then coming back. And
Wow. How
uh,
did that end up in your mailbox?
well, it was taken from his body by a Chicago Tribune reporter who meant to send it to his widow, our mother, and never did, and retired. And it was at the bottom of a filing cabinet. And so this archivist from the Chicago Tribune came across it. And on the front, it said Byron, that was my father's name, Byron Darnton, New York Times. So he just sent it to the executive editor of the Times, then, Abe Rosenthal, with a little note that said, I don't know, maybe this rightly belongs to someone there. And Abe, who hadn't really taken it on board, just kind of asked his secretary to put it in my mailbox. But I tell you, it was like a visitation or something.
Yeah. And what
And
timing? It was a week
yeah,
before you left for overseas.
yeah. And it went right up to the last moment. In fact, he said plane overhead, and then he said, uh, well, he didn't say enemy or ours. He used the common expression during the war for the Japanese people, which is today viewed as derogatory. I mean, he said Jap or ours.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and it turned out it was. The plane came back, dropped 3 bombs, and none of them hit this ship directly. It was actually a boat, not a ship. But the shrapnel came and killed 2 people, one of which was my father. So
Wow. So he was writing his experience right up to the moment of
yes,
his death.
and the last page is ripped out. So presumably it happened right then. And so I became kind of, I don't want to say obsessed, but I wondered who was he? And and so after my own career, after I went abroad and everything, I came back. I started doing research to find out who he was. And my wife and I ended up by going to Papua New Guinea, which is where this happened, and to the little village that was just offshore where the boat was. And we knew from articles that his body and the other body were taken by canoe onto the beach. And we talked to the people in the village, and there was we thank goodness we came with a kind of a expat who knew the area, who appointed himself the chief of police, because this part of PNG, Papua New Guinea, is very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. You're not just allowed to step on anyone's property. But we had been prepared, our visit, and they treated us with, great ceremony. They did what's called a spear charge, where you're not supposed to move, and they come at you with a spear. Young kids mostly. It wasn't frankly frightening, but we had to sort of stand there and pretend to be, a little alarmed and brave. And then we went into a longhouse and met the chief, and suddenly things turned kind of bad. I don't know. We I had a translator, but he wasn't from the village, but he claimed to know the language. And the son of the chief got up and was making these statements that were sort of alarming. He's saying, my father suffered during the war, and the Americans came here. And when then they went home, they were given homes and money by the government, and they were looked after. And the Americans never did anything for us, and kind of working himself up more and more. And finally, this guy who had the expat who brought us, who had been asleep during some of this, woke up and said, "All right, have we come to the money part yet?" And and he negotiated money that we'd all give to them for fine. That was happening. And suddenly everything changed, and the little kids began cheering, and women brought out food, and it was great. And so I said, is there anyone here who remembers what happened? And they took me over to an elderly man, and I interviewed him, and he said, I was 6 years old on my way to school, and this plane came over, and he described it. And he said, and then a canoe came and brought the 2 white men and put them on the beach. And he said, come with me and I'll show you. And he took me down to the beach, right, right to
Right
this.
where your dad was pulled
Yeah.
ashore.
And I don't know, that just kind of brought everything home. And I'm not even sure how to describe the emotions I felt, but some of it was anger, just anger at him for being, he hadn't worn a helmet, and he had been in World War I in the Red Arrow Division, so he was very used to combat. I suspect he was kind of cavalier about it and everything. So anyway, I began investigating his life and my mother's life back then, and found out a lot of things. They each had been married to someone else when they met. Um, and they were part of a kind of a lively scene, Greenwich Village scene for the most part.
Mm.
uh, with people like Edna St. Vincent Millay and writers and advertising people and creative types. There was a lot of alcohol. It was so important in the 20s and 30s to their group. Um, the
Yes.
the letters home were just wonderful about, I can't wait to sit under that tree with a Tom Collins, which you make so well, you know. And then we discovered our mother was still alive, that they had never married. And suddenly this whole image of the perfect, man, and the perfect couple that were in total harmony about everything began to shake a little. And that's what I loved about uh, writing a memoir. It's called Almost a Family, is when you discover reality that bumps up against the myths and the legends that you have. Um, it's total enlightenment, and you realize humans are such deep and kind of fragile characters, and we come up with narratives to explain our lives. And our mother clearly came up with one that was formative for both my brother and myself, that turned out to have cracks in it. And yet was so important to us. It is an absolutely wonderful thing to write a memoir and just tell the truth. It's kind of cleansing. So
Yeah, I can
after
imagine.
that, I thought, well, I've now said everything I have to say. But then I got interested in this whole idea on the global warming issue. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do something with that. And I just took my time and took quite a while to write it, and used the theme of what happens if things get worse and worse, which they're bound to, and we adopt some kind of misbegotten scheme to save the world. That is to say, in this case, solar radiation management, reflecting back sunlight by putting particles up in our stratosphere, which is a very real proposition and is being experimented on now.
No,
And
this is Burning
I
Sky,
do.
your new novel.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, so I decided to use that as a thematic background and to have a cast of characters that were limited. I mean, that center on one particular family with three generations. So it covers 70 years, beginning next year, 2025. And the first generation is a man who raises the alarm about global warming. Think of maybe James Henson type, from NASA, a brilliant, brave scientist who something happens to him, something nefarious, but he does leave behind a young son who is very brilliant, extraordinarily brilliant, but flawed, and raised by a colleague of his. And that son is the one who perfects this geoengineering scheme to save the world, and has to turn toward tough measures to get it in place. So the country becomes basically an autocratic regime, and he becomes a kind of the power, holds all the power. But he has two children, a son and a daughter, who are raised separately and come for him at the end to overthrow him and to try and fix what's gone wrong with this scheme and put an end to it. And they succeed. So it's got this kind of movement over three generations of strong meaning forceful. I don't know if they're well drawn, but strong characters. And that's basically um, the outline of it. I don't, I'm not totally against in fact, I think we should be experimenting with some ways to kind of help us out of this mess we're in. But cautiously. And my great fear is because if we still keep relying on these fossil fuels and everything, we'll reach a point where we have to do something like this as a last resort without being fully aware of the implications. And nature's oldest law will come into play, the law of unintended consequences.
Exactly. Exactly. The boy, and history's full of them,
Oh,
where we intervene, and there's a natural order to things, but then when we intervene, boy, it can be a very fragile system. But I remember when Greg Easterbrook wrote no, not the first. He wrote a big cover story in Newsweek magazine about the environment, and I remember this point he made. This is many years ago.
right.
I was in my 20s at the time, and he had said that basically he said the fact is nature is virtually indestructible. What is very destructible is that is the narrow bandwidth of climatic and environmental conditions that allow for human life. So it's not that we're trying to say, because it's be a lot of people were eye rollers at the time, and
Yeah.
all this stuff about nature. And it's like, nature will survive. We couldn't destroy nature if we
Yeah.
wanted to, but we will not survive
Right.
because we're a very fragile, this was a separate article that I had read that said, basically the more complex the system, and human beings are the most complex entity on the planet, as
Yes.
far as we
Yeah.
know, the more fragile it is. So we're
Yeah.
highly fragile.
Yeah.
We're
I mean,
highly susceptible to extinction.
look what's happening with the increase, most people think of global temperatures from pre-industrial revolution to now. I mean, it's probably upward around 1.5 degrees centigrade. That sounds so little. Uh, uh,
And
But
yet,
look what's happening, the extreme storms and the hurricanes and the floods and the droughts and the rising sea levels and all this from such a what would seem to be a kind of minor increase if you think, oh,
yeah,
1.5 degrees, that's not so much. I could stand that on any particular day. But no, it's the average of a worldwide move and you're right, nature will persist and the planet will persist, but who knows what yeah,
what comes of us.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's Burning Sky. Are you working on something now? First of all, when did Burning Sky publish?
Oh, just 2 months ago, was it?
Just 2 months ago. So
Yeah.
very new.
Well, over the summer and June, July, I guess it was in July, by Arcade Publishing, and uh, a wonderful woman named Jeanette Seaver, who with her husband Dick Seaver used to run Grove Press and discovered UNESCO and people, some of the great French writers, including Beckett, and
Wow.
brought them to an English-speaking American audience. So yeah, it was published, I guess, in July, and you
Do you have
know,
another one in the works?
I'm toying with the idea of doing something on Spain. We lived in Spain. I loved Spain.
Mm.
The
Now, this
Spanish,
would be a novel.
yes, yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
So you're thinking Spain because you're well acquainted with it. Do you love the setting? Is it the whole vibe of Spain is something that you want to have an opportunity to engross yourself
Yeah, yeah,
in the writing of the book? Yeah. Yeah. So
exactly.
you'll probably make it quite atmospheric, I would imagine.
I hope. I hope.
That's the goal. So we always have a goal, and then it's like, did I execute it well or not?
Yeah,
And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. How has your writing changed as you have aged? And if you could bifurcate the question just a little bit, or your answer a little bit, if it's warranted, John. And the reason I say that is there's the changes that we get from, hey, I'm more experienced now, so I'm better at what I do, or I'm wiser at what I do. Then there is another aspect to that being just that, as you age, you have this larger frame of reference. You think differently. Um, and that should, perhaps your entire ethos changes when it comes to writing. So what would you say in terms of your own writing? How has it changed as you've gotten older?
Huh. Well, I uh I think my goal is a bit different. You may have mentioned something about plot driven. I think I fall into that category of writers who, centers a lot of the effort around plot. And that's fun to do and can be exciting. But as I age, I've come to understand, I think, the importance of character. And character is really now, in my mind, essential to any good work. I'm not sure I'm there, but I would hold that up as a goal. Sonny Mehta, who was at Knopf for many years, once over lunch, he said to me, all really great writing stems from character. And he was kind of, I think, trying to push me in that direction. And I kind of saw the light. So I am now especially in this newest endeavor, not Burning Sky, but the one I'm working on now, trying to grapple with things like contradictions in people that make them kind of seem real, and hidden things that come out through character, not so much plot. I
love that you're saying this, because I want to read you a quote from Larry McMurtry, the great
Oh,
novelist who
well,
passed away
he's
recently.
wonderful,
He
wonderful.
is wonderful. And what he said about character, here's his quotation. For me, the novel is a character creation. Style is nice, plot is nice, structure is okay, social significance is okay, symbolism worms its way in, timeliness is okay too, but unless the character convinces and lives, um, unless the characters convince and live, the book's got no chance. He
Yeah.
was very much a character, and I read books for characters as well. And so you're a McMurtry fan as well.
Oh, yeah.
And but to your point, and to the point that you're making, that now you're gravitating more towards the idea of character, and you had this person who kind of put out the morsels, put some breadcrumbs out there. You think that he
Mhm.
was maybe suggesting start to introduce a deeper element of that into your writing.
Could be, yeah, could be. He was a very brilliant editor, now gone, sadly.
Yeah.
He ran Knopf for many years and handled, many really excellent writers. Um, yeah, I think
Speaking of
character.
excellent writers, who inspired your writing?
Oh, wow. That's
Is there a few that you would say, um, whether they inspired your writing, or you just feel that
I
these are a
I
few that I
feel
enjoy the
I
most?
feel awkward answering that because and I promise I'm not trying to pretend modesty, but I don't think the ones I admire so much, I don't think I even can fit into their category.
Oh, I understand. I understand. And we all feel that way. I love Don DeLillo, and I'm thinking,
I'm
uh,
funny. That's a name that I just would have come up with.
there you go. Yeah.
And
And yet we don't pretend to have his skill, but at
Yeah.
the same time, you always want to appreciate the greats.
Yeah. I'm now reading a Spanish novelist, Javier Marias, who is I don't know, maybe the greatest writer Spain has produced this century, who is absolutely spellbinding,
Mm.
wonderful in translation. I mean, it's, I like the idea now of trying novelists in different countries, like Mahfouz about Egypt, and the whole sweep of history and culture there. Mahfouz, who won the Nobel Prize years ago. Foreign writers from Turkey, other countries. There really some wonderful ones out there, and I keep thinking, American literature should open up more, and people should be reading more of the works from the rest of the world.
Yes, yes, I agree. I agree, and I have to do more of that. I have to admit that I tend to stick with the American and Canadian and British writers primarily, but
Sure.
that's certainly a good piece of advice. My guest has been John Darnton, a novelist. He's out with a new one, Burning Sky, and a very, very timely novel in terms of climate change and some of the challenges we're facing. He's contemplating perhaps his next novel being set in Spain, where he spent time as a foreign correspondent, a lot of other places as well, as I said at the top of the program. Distinguished 40-year career with the New York Times, covering everything from Gotham City Hall to places like Africa and Poland and London and Madrid and so on. John, this has been really interesting, and what a career that you have lived. And now you're up to, what is it, six novels or 7 books and 6 novels, is it?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Including your memoir. The title of your memoir again is
Almost a Family.
Almost a Family. Amazing story you told about getting that box in the mail and then going to the island and finding out seeing where your dad was pulled ashore and all his remains. And wow, I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the program. And
Oh,
of
well,
course, I wish you best of luck with all your future projects.
thank you, Mike. I enjoyed this interview a lot, and I like your questions.